I'm here with Colin Seis, a fifth generation farmer from Australia. His claim to fame is actually the originator of pasture cropping, which is a very unique regenerative agriculture method that he's now teaching all over the world. He's been developing this over the last 20 years at his family farm that is probably one of the most researched farms in the entire world. And Colin, it's great to see you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, so go ahead and tell us what it's all about. What is this? And I see your first slide here. How did we get agriculture wrong? Because I think a lot of us know that we did. And we're scratching our heads wondering how do we recover.
That is true. I'm going to talk today about that, about how we got agriculture wrong, or pose the question, did we really get agriculture wrong? And I'm going to present some methods that I've used on my farm to regenerate my farm, but not only regenerate the farm and soil ecosystem and farm ecosystem, but produce healthy food off it as well. Now I'll just start with where I am. I'm obviously in Australia, as Brendan said, but about 200 miles northwest of Sydney, which is in southeastern Australia. Myself and my son Nick are on the farm. There's 2,000 acres here, and it's granite soil. It's not very fertile soil, but it's okay soil. 26-inch rainfall. Now it's a restored native grassland, but we don't have any irrigation on it as well. So we've had to do this with natural rainfall and the soil type we had. Just a bit of an idea of the enterprises we have. We run 4,000 merino sheep here, which is for wool and meat production. Some trading in cattle, as in we have cattle on the farm during different seasons. I grow about 500 acres of crops, what is normally called small grain crops, which is wheat, oats, cereal, rye, those type of crops. They're all grown using the pasture cropping methods that I developed in 1993, and I have been growing them that way since that time. Also, a major part of our enterprise is harvesting and selling native grass seed, which we harvest off our grasslands here. Also, I run one of the largest working Kelpie dog studs in the world and sell dogs for sheep and cattle work around the world. And another part of our enterprise mix is the sale of merino rams to other sheep and wool producers. Now, if we look at agriculture and why and how it started, or the agricultural methods that we use now around the world, it started in Mesopotamia over 10,000 years ago. And it started then with the Sumerian people harvesting many of their native seeds from their grasslands at the time. And the native seeds happen to be wheat and oats and barley, which are the crops that have been developed over time that we grow in many parts of the world now. The people of Mesopotamia also domesticated sheep and goats around that same time, about 10,000 years ago. The plough was developed about a couple of thousand years later, 8,000 years ago, and then oxen were domesticated, or cattle were domesticated and trained to pull the plough. Egyptians and then later Romans fine-tuned these agricultural techniques, and then that was then adopted in Europe. And that is really the birth of modern agriculture. But that form of agriculture has created deserts around the world. Not only created deserts, but major saline areas, poor dysfunctional soil. One thing it has done is destroyed grasslands all over the world. So we need to really ask the question, did our ancestors get agriculture wrong? And are there better ways to grow crops? And are there better ways to graze animals? And simply, are there better ways of doing this? And I would suggest that there certainly are better ways of doing it. Well, we have to find better ways of doing it. We can't continue with the agricultural methods that have been developed up until this point in time. So, were the methods of growing crops and managing animals wrong from the start? And are there better ways of producing food and fibre? To answer that question and give you some idea of my history and how I developed the methods that I've developed, we'll just go back in time a bit to the 1860s when my great-grandparents started farming here and settled this area and bought the original settlement block on this farm. They started with merino sheep and wool, which is very common in Australia. Merino sheep are the most farmed animal breed, really, whether it's sheep or cattle. And they started growing wheat in 1868. And obviously horse teams were used to sow wheat in that era. And up until the 1920s, horse teams were used until my father adopted industrial agriculture in the 1930s. And my father started with horse teams, but then started using tractors, and he started growing wheat in 1930s. He was still running sheep as well. And wheat growing in the 1930s was very profitable. So my father grew wheat continuously during that era. And one thing that is an interesting thing, but also important, my father didn't need any or require any fertilizer to grow wheat crops in the 1930s. And the photo I have here in front of us, him standing in a wheat crop, is a good wheat crop in any era. And now we need huge amounts of fertilizer to grow wheat crops all around the world. And we need to ask the question, why can't we do that now? And really the answer is because our soils are now dysfunctional and lacking nutrients to grow crops and minerals to grow crops. My father, because there was good money in growing wheat during that era, he continually grew wheat through the 1930s and did major damage to the farm and the soil. And because he was ploughing the soil, he destroyed the grasslands quite quickly, then had major erosion problems. And the photo you can see on the right-hand side here is actually a photo that my mother took of one of our big eagles, which is like the American eagle's big 6-foot wingspan. But the photo isn't about the eagle. It's about the erosion behind it. And that happened about 5 years after my father started farming. So he did major damage very quickly. But because he did that damage, it was of great concern to him. He fixed the problems very within the next 20 years. And he was very much a pioneer in what we now call industrial agriculture, and adopted many of the methods that we now call the Green Revolution, sort of from the 1940s and 50s on. And he fixed the problems he created by sowing the whole farm down to introduced pastures like clover and ryegrass. But those pastures needed fertilizer, so he was fertilizing them and cultivating soils, and then in the 1960s and 70s using high rates of pesticides and fertilizers. And that's the form of agriculture that I grew up in. And I started to adopt some of those methods in the 1970s as well. That high input method of agriculture was very productive in that era, so and it worked very well. However, no one knew at the time the damage it was doing. We had lost our perennial grassland, and it was replaced by annual introduced pastures. The farm became more infested with weeds and became unproductive. And even with all those weeds and being unproductive, it was costing us over $80,000 annually to maintain this farm. And that was mostly related to fertilizer, artificial fertilizer, phosphorus fertilizer primarily. Now, we can take that form of agriculture all over the world. Like if we look at the form of agriculture that my father was using, that was adopted all over the world. So, um, but it started to crash here on the farm on Winona in the 1970s. Fertilizer costs became too high. Costs of sowing pastures became too high. Soils became hard and compacted. Salinity problems, trees dying. We were going broke, and we're going broke because it was costing us too much money. So, but around the world for the last 60 years, this form of agriculture has been adopted, even though it started to fail in the 1970s. And it's been influenced by the use of monoculture crops supported by high rates of fertiliser and pesticides. And it's been an ecological disaster. It's been a total failure, yet this form of agriculture still gets promoted. And that form of agriculture is crashing all over the world because it doesn't function in an ecologically sound way. And no one looks at farms as ecosystems. Now, if we look at what's happening in agriculture, we have reduced soil carbon levels, which requires more irrigation, reduced soil fertility, more artificial fertiliser, increasing insect attack, which is more insecticide, increasing crop disease, more fungicide. And there's a bit of a pattern developing here. We need more and more inputs for agriculture to function, which I love to call moron agriculture. It really requires more and more product to put for agriculture to even function. But very few people seem to be realising that this is a disaster and it has failed. Our farms should function as ecosystems, and very few people ever look at that. Ecology and agriculture rarely ever put together in the same sentence. Now, to go on from that, or to expand on that, we're often told it's only possible to feed 9 billion people in the year 2050 with the use of more inputs of chemical fertiliser, pesticides, and now genetically modified crops. I do not have enough adjectives to describe how angry that makes me feel. Well, I have plenty of adjectives, but I can't use them as in this presentation. That is potentially a disaster. That is not only not going to work, but if we want a planet for us humans to live on, we cannot possibly go that way. Agriculture is supposed to be about food, but there's something fundamentally wrong, because not only is our food now full of pesticides and herbicides, but it doesn't have the minerals in it that it used to have. And just this slide here and the next one is from the United Kingdom Ministry of Agriculture, and we can see from that the reduction in minerals like copper, calcium, iron, magnesium, potassium. And now it is possible to buy an orange today that contains 0 or no vitamin C at all. If we go on to meat, it's the same story. Iron, copper, calcium, magnesium, all of those our meat has got reduced nutrients in it. So it is no wonder that we need to take vitamin tablets all the time. Our food does not have the minerals in it that it used to have in 1940. And if you look at the screen, the last work that's been done, this is in 1991, and I would bet that in the last 20 years, that those minerals have depleted even more, but very, very hard to find that information. Most of this decline in nutrients is related to a serious decline in soil health and soil carbon. Poor quality food is caused by poor quality soil, and it is that simple. So when we look at all of what my family did and what's happening around the world, why and how did I change? It's been suggested that I'm probably a lunatic, and they could be right, but during the 1970s, the cost of farm production was becoming high and unprofitable. But in 1979, we had a major bushfire, or what people in the US called wildfires, and it destroyed the whole farm, really. Destroyed our homestead, our house, all the infrastructure, a shearing shed where we shear our sheep. 3,000 sheep were killed out of the 4,000 we owned. Many of the surviving ones were burnt in as well. All the buildings was destroyed. All the fencing was destroyed, and we were broke, instantly broke with that fire. So how do you survive that? So what I did was looked at low input agriculture methods in the 1980s. No one was looking at low input agriculture. Well, had to be more than low input agriculture methods for me. It had to be no input agriculture because I had no money in the 1980s. So I stopped using pasture fertiliser and pesticides. Couldn't afford them. Focused on ground cover, 100% ground cover. And adopted holistic plan grazing in 1993, developed pasture cropping in 1993, and combined the two, which is where I really got great results in 1995. But what I really focused on was restoring Monona to grassland or prairies, or the original native prairie or grassland. Just a little bit on grazing management, what we do here, and I won't dwell on it, it's only one slide. With our 4,000 merino sheep, we run only in 2 mobs and rotate them. When we have cattle, we include them with the sheep. We have 75 individual paddocks, and we work on plant recovery. So we try to get 3 to 4 months and even 5 months plant recovery. And the animals, or the sheep, are very much an important part of preparing our areas or our paddocks that we plant crops into. Now, this slide here, very important slide, and that's a photo of a bottle of beer, an Australian bottle of beer, which is very important in that good friend of mine, Darryl Clough, and I entered and developed pasture cropping in 1993 after about 10 or 12 of these beers one night. Because you had to be drunk of thinking of something so stupid, because we've always killed everything to plant crops. And what we thought of was, or noticed after 10 or 12 beers, we were killing our native perennial grasses to plant a crop. Those grasses were dormant or went asleep for the winter, and that was when we were growing our crops. Why did we need to kill those grasses? So we thought about this, and then within a couple of weeks, we were zero tilling or planting crops into those dormant grasses, and it worked first time. So alcohol, or in our case, bottles of beer, were very important in the development of this technique, which is unique around the world. So what it is a perennial cover cropping technique, where annual crops are zero tilled into dormant perennial grass or grassland without killing the perennial grass. And if we look at, for 10,000 years, we have killed grassland to grow crops. And pasture cropping is the first cropping technique developed where perennial grass is not killed and crops are planted into living grassland, living dormant grassland. So zero-till sowing of crops is what the techniques we use. So I'm not going to dwell on this. I don't have time in this presentation. We don't plough. We never kill perennial plants, and we're zero-tilling. Weeds are primarily managed by creating large quantities of thick litter and by using good grazing management of livestock. We can, especially when people first start, use very, very careful use of very selective herbicides. But most people move towards almost an organic system over time, as we have here. Very, very few herbicides used here now at all. Now, just quickly, what pasture cropping will do, it allows grazing. We still graze these pastures. In fact, we use animals to create mulch and litter that we plant the crop into. We can produce very good crops for grain and or forage. It does improve soil structure. It does improve soil organic carbon, improve nutrient cycling, certainly reduce costs, and it restores the farm ecosystem. So when we look at that, and why, and all around the world we put cattle into feedlots and feed them grain when these animals are herbivores. They should be eating grass. So how do we get cattle out of feedlots? We don't need them in feedlots. It is a disaster, and it's part of our industrialised agriculture model, which has been a major disaster. Sheep and cattle can be fattened on good quality pasture and or species diverse green crops. So how to produce extra quality forage for grass-fed animals while doing all of this while restoring grassland or perennial pasture or prairies, reduce fertilizer, reduce herbicides, reduce insecticides, improve soil structure, soil health, and soil nutrients. So we need to ask the question, why are crops grown in monocultures of single species, and why have they been grown in monocultures for thousands of years? Ease of harvest, ease of weed control, and the need to separate different seeds. But the main reason is we've always done it that way. And we humans are supposed to be intelligent, but we seem to always just copy the things we've always done. Just a few slides here on the sequence of cropping, of growing a crop. Starting here now with a grassland which has 50 or 60 perennial Australian native grassland species in it. Next slide. We harvest native grass seed off these areas also, which is a major part of our income. Then we plant with zero tilling crop into that, a multi-species crop now into that after it's been grazed and mulched with sheep or cattle. Next slide shows that effect. We've planted a crop into that. That's all mulch of the grassland that the animals have mulched onto the soil. We haven't used any method other than animals to put that material onto the soil surface. Now we're planting a multi-species crop, which in this case is oats, forage, brassica, vetch, radish, clover, field peas, turnips. It can be more than that, but this is what we've used here. That's multi-species, just a photo of multi-species crop showing field pea and oats and radish, and the dry material in there is the dormant grass that now is asleep for that winter period in amongst that crop. That mix of species sown into a grassland does produce superior quality and quantity stock feed, vast and very fast improvements in soil health, soil structure, carbon and nutrient cycling. We can add nitrogen with legumes. It does create weed control. It does create insect control with flowering plants which attract beneficial insects, and we can still harvest the crop after it's grazed. That grazing of that crop does produce better quality diet, healthy diet, faster fattening of livestock, faster growth rates and more feed. Now, we can, and I do, add vegetables like turnip, radish, peas to that crop as well. So it is possible now, and I'm doing it here, to grow vegetables in a grassland as well as cereal crops. So it opens up the potential to do many, many things. We don't necessarily need vegetable farms now to grow vegetables. We can do that within a grassland, and that further improves soil, and it certainly produces far better quality food for human consumption as well as animal consumption in that now improved soil. So just a photo here of a crop that we had in 2015, which had oats, barley, vetch, radish, pea, turnip, clover, and forage brassica. Now, we harvested that crop, this photo, that is taken at the same place. That crop's been harvested. We harvested the oats off that, or the mix of species off that, primarily oats. And you can see all the green material underneath the crop, some of the brassica species primarily there, we grazed that after the crop was harvested. This is a photo of the grain that we harvested, a mixed species grain. The darker, smaller seed in that photo was after we separated the small seed from the large seed from it. So we harvested a multi-species grain crop off that. Now that grassland is grazed after the crop is harvested, and we then harvest native grass seed after the crop is harvested. That seed is sold for revegetation, and in the future it can be sold for human consumption. Native people all over the world, including our Aboriginal people here in Australia, a lot of their diet was seed from our grasslands, which they made into a form of bread, and so that can be a great form of food for human consumption in the future as well. We just need to rediscover a lot of what our native people did around the world. And this is a photo of that same area 6 months later, a functioning growing grassland again. So over that 12-month period, the paddock has produced grazing from the grassland, grazing of the crop, grain from the crop, and vegetables. Grazing of the grassland after harvest, and native grass seed. All of those are in a 12-month period on one area of land. Huge production of this. We don't need all that industrialised form of agriculture to be very, very productive. I would challenge that this is far more productive than a single multi-species crop. While it's done that and produced that huge amount of food off that area, or crop off that area, as well as feeding livestock, it has improved soil structure, soil health, and nutrient cycling. It has had great insect control, reduced on our fertiliser, no insecticide, no fungicide, and no ploughing of soil. That also has restored the grassland and soil and produced healthy, nutrient-dense food. So what were the results on Winona? I'm going to present some data here from some of our research organisations and universities in Australia that have done work here, but it has restored the grassland or our prairie, or the prairie. When I started with this 23 years ago, it was annual weeds, and it did include a few native species, but only a small percentage of they were grassland species, 10%. Now there are very, very few annual weeds, and there's 60 species of native grass, forbs, and herbs. Well, it's 84% of our grassland species. So we have planted no perennial grass. None of those perennial native species that have ever been planted. What we've really done is created the conditions for the seed that has been sitting in the soil for 50 years to germinate. And the pasture cropping technique, when overlaid with the grazing management, realistic planned grazing that Alan Savory developed, combination of those two things has been shown to stimulate the growth of perennial of seed, perennial grass seed that's sat in the soil for years and years. So no insecticide's been used here for 20 years, and we get no insect attack in crops or pastures. That is supposed to be impossible. Now, some work that was done by Australian National University student Elise Wendon showed that insect numbers have increased by 600% on the farm here, and insect diversity has increased by 125%. But we no longer have insect attacking crops or pastures. The reason why we get no insect attacking crops or pastures is that most of those insect increase is been predators like spiders and predatory wasps that control the crop damaging and the pasture damaging insects. So there's been no fungicide used here for over 20 years, and there's no crop disease or pasture disease. And how has that possible. Industrial agriculture uses more and more fungicide. In fact, it's rare that you can grow crops without it. Soil microbe tests have shown huge increase in soil microbiology or soil microbes. Fungi have increased, bacteria have increased, protozoa and nematodes, and that huge diversity of soil life is controlling crop plant disease. Now, fertiliser used here on pastures for over 30 years, and crop fertiliser has been reduced by 70%, and now we're using more and more organic fertilisers. How is that possible? How can we grow crops with very little fertiliser? Living, growing plants are the drivers of soil health, soil structure and nutrient cycling. Plants add dead and decaying material to the soil, which feeds soil microbes, and plant roots or plants exude sugars through their roots, which feed soil microbes. It's plants that drive soils and soil health, and plant diversity, and especially perennial plants, but also the plants that we're using in our pasture cropping mix or multi-species pasture cropping mix is driving this improvement in soil health and making nutrients available to other plants. Now, this is a photo of my soil and my neighbouring soil. These were only taken about 15 metres apart over a fence line. There's over 2 feet of soil built on the one on the left, and the neighbour's soil only has about 4 inches of topsoil on it. Now, that soil has over 200% more organic carbon than the one on the right. It has sequestered over 50, well, almost 60 tonne of carbon per hectare, and that is and over a 10-year period, it has removed over 200 tonne per hectare, about 100 tonne per acre of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now, if we can get more farmers doing this, this type of farming, growing more plants is really all it is, and plant diversity, we can remove much of our carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We can, that is, farmers all around the world, can be the cure for a lot of our climate change, global warming problems that we've got by simply removing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it in our soil as carbon. It is very simple and it can be done. The other benefits of that is that now this soil holds 200% more water, and all of the nutrients, including trace elements, have increased by an average of 162%. That is relevant because those nutrients are now available in the food we're consuming from these soils, and also the nutrients are available in the animals now that are grazing these grasslands. Is it profitable? Obviously, this is very important from a farming point of view, and yes, it is very profitable. Annual income is higher compared to when I was farming with the industrial type of agriculture. Crop yields are similar to what they were then. We are running more sheep and cattle. Now I harvest and sell over 1,000 kilograms of native grass seed annually. And that's significant because that seed is $70 a kilogram, so it's high value seed. Soil organic carbon levels are increasing. Soil phosphorus, calcium, nitrogen, pH, magnesium, and trace elements are all increasing. That's not just in the availables, but the totals are increasing as well. Now, all of this has been possible with $80,000 less inputs and far less labour. Far less labour is required on the farm now. So everything is far easier than it used to be. Industrial agriculture is destroying our farms, soil, and our planet. How can we produce more food without destroying our farms and our planet? If we look at primarily what I've been talking about, but vertical stacking of farming and grazing enterprises. In other words, we can stack enterprises on the same area. We can grow different enterprises on the same area of land, and I'll explain that. Now, if we look at what I've just spoken about, on a given area in over a 12-month period, we've produced grain, sheep meat, cattle, wool, vegetables, native grass seed, and also that can be native grass seed for human consumption. And I really haven't mentioned carbon sequestration and trading in carbon. So all of that can be done, which I am doing here now, but we can add to that. It can be greater than that as well. By including vegetables in a multi-species mix, we can produce vegetables for human consumption as well as produce a grain crop. Those vegetables can be brassica crops like turnip, kale, and peas, and we can also do a summer crop as well. All of this can be done while we restore grassland, cycle nutrients, and improve our soil ecosystem. The enterprises in a vertically stacked enterprise mix need to be ecologically compatible. The reason it works is because they are ecologically compatible. They complement each other. In other words, they complement each other ecologically. They complement each other financially. And if they're ecologically compatible, they will regenerate the farm and they'll be more profitable. So to sum all this up, agriculture and sound ecological practices should function together. Agriculture doesn't have to destroy farms, ecosystems, and the planet. Good agricultural practices can produce vast amounts of good quality food, far more than the industrial model. Now, we can produce far more food using these methods. We can also regenerate our grasslands or our prairies. We can restore our soil ecosystems, supply and cycle soil nutrients, control insect damage and plant disease. In other words, agriculture can be more profitable, regenerate our farms, ecosystems, and the planet, but agricultural practices need to function closer to how nature had it originally designed. Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing, Colin. Thank you. It's the second time I've seen your presentation, but it never ceases to amaze me what you've accomplished. And from what I understand, part of the reason your operation has been researched so much is people didn't believe what you were doing was possible. Is that right?
That is correct. Yes. Especially when I was getting early results here of being able to reduce fertilizer. People thought that was impossible. And when I was saying that we got no longer got insect attack, remember this is 15, 20 years ago, that these results were starting to come through, no one was thinking about this, that it was possible that to be able to manage things naturally without all of these pesticides and fertilizers and that we've now had forced upon us. So I challenged the scientists to come and do their own research. And also Dr. Christine Jones, who's been a wonderful supporter of mine and really was the science brain behind a lot of the development of pasture cropping and what I've been doing on this farm. She also challenged her fellow scientists to do the research on the farm here as well.
Also, from what I understand, organic agriculture used to have more of a focus on multi-species cover cropping. I'm not entirely certain of that, but what's your understanding? Because I think that organics obviously pasture cropping didn't exist as far as combining grazing and planting into dormant grassland and so forth. That's what makes this so unique and moving our agricultural systems more toward an ecological model. But you've been around all this for a while. Were you familiar with how organics was conceived, and was it more similar to this in any regards than it is now, and how it's practiced now?
Yes, organic agriculture has been very, very close to having it right. But one of the biggest problems with organic agriculture is ploughing. The ploughing soil is very, very destructive, no matter how you do it. Turning soil upside down is extremely destructive and kills soil microbes and destroys soil structure. The organic people would have done a wonderful job over the years removing pesticides and working out at how to get soils functioning closer to it as an ecosystem, but could never really get a handle on how they could grow crops without ploughing and well, especially without using herbicides. Now, what's happened recently with cover crops, and Gabe Brown is probably a very good example of what's happening with this. As we grow, we can grow annual cover crops with multi-species, multiple species, and what happens there, as it does with my pasture cropping, the more species you get in there, the faster it drives soils and soil health, cycle nutrients, and control weeds. So now we can grow crops like in a very degraded system, a multi-species cover crop, get it on the ground with either rolling it or better still with animals, mulch it onto the ground, then plant crops into that. Now that is very similar to what I'm doing, except mine's a perennial system. I don't need to plant the covers because the perennial grass is my cover. What I'm doing perennial, which is perennial cover cropping, is the reverse of annual cover cropping in that my multi-species crop is my crop. It is not the cover. It's, if you understand that. I don't know whether that's confused everyone or not.
No, I understand. Oh, by the way, is Gabe Brown the one who figured out that by having cover crop mixes that included species from 5 different families, I think it is, brassicas, grasses, legumes, cereals, and chenopod's, is that the 5?
Yep.
Was it him that discovered that?
No, Gabe would say that the main driver of the multi-species mix, or the main person, was David Brandt in Iowa. And Gabe would also say that. But Gabe is taking it to another level, and also incorporate animals in it, where Dave hasn't been incorporating animals. But David Brandt, I guess, is the pioneer in the US of multi-species cover crops. Where I developed multi-species mixes, I was using growing oats and single species into my diverse grassland here. I spoke at No Till in the Plains conference in 2012, and met Gabe and Dave and all of these guys that were doing multi-species cover crops. And the penny dropped with me in that I realized then that a multi-species crop would move my soils even faster in soil health and nutrient cycling. And so what I've done here is combined what I originally developed with pasture cropping, and combined it with what Gabe and Dave had been doing, and sort of overlaid the two of them.
Got it. What I find absolutely fascinating about that 5 species mix, or 5, is it families? 5 families?
Yeah, we need at least 4 or 5, and there's a grass species and grass and brassica, a legume, one missing here somewhere.
Chenopod?
Yes, yep. So, yeah, as many in there as we can possibly put in there. Now, if you relate that to just a wheat crop or a corn, in that they, as a monoculture, they're a single-dimensional root system. If we mix all of those species together, then we have a 3-dimensional root system, and that's why we're starting to drive soils and soil health and carbon and all the wonderful benefits. And it shouldn't be a surprise to us, because that's what nature does. Nature never has anything in as a single species. It had, but the original grassland here and your prairies had 200 or 400, probably in the US prairies, 400 species. in that original grassland or prairie. So why are we growing crops as a single species? It's just madness.
And I think one thing here that's so counterintuitive, but we're seeing that the more roots you have in the soil, the richer the soil gets, and yet we've sort of maybe been conditioned to think that roots only take things out of the soil, but they put so much into the soil that
Yep.
the sugars and so forth that they exude to feed the organisms, and then the organisms create their little home out of those sugars and build complex carbon structures and the whole thing as they then go out and mine the parent material of the soil with their organic acids and enzymes and make minerals available to the plants. The whole thing just grows and becomes more complex and more stable and so forth. It's
That's
totally counterintuitive from a mind
that
that has been conditioned to think of roots as extractive.
that's exactly right, and we've been told that by with the industrial model that if we have a plant growing or plants growing there, they are removing nutrients. And then when they remove nutrients, you've got to replace them with fertilizer. That's the biggest lie we've ever been told. That's dreadful information. All a plant does is cycle nutrients round and round. It doesn't remove nutrients. Okay, if we totally remove that plant, you will remove some nutrients. But I mean, we have never looked at the benefits that plants do. And I guess if you're selling fertilizer, you don't really want people to know that information either. That we're cycling nutrients and bringing nutrients up from depth, and not only that, we're releasing nutrients from the soil, from the original soil particles or the particles in the soil.
Yeah, and the other thing about this that's interesting is we're used to thinking of plants as competing with each other for scarce resources, and whether it's water, minerals, and other nutrients in the soil. And I suppose maybe there are some rare instances where there is competition, but what we're seeing with these multi-species cover crops and many other polycultural instead of monocultural systems is that the plants actually get more done when there's more of them. And I guess with these 5 species or the 5 families represented in a cover crop, you have all of these phenolic compounds being exuded into the soil. Is that it? And the microbes then get stimulated and go into a supercharged metabolism and build soil even faster, something like that.
Yeah, and I guess we don't really know exactly what's happening under there, and it's only an emerging field, really. Soil microbiology and soil ecosystems, we're really only just starting to look at them. But in the past, we've certainly got it wrong. In the way we've gone with agriculture, with our single species and heaps of fertilizer, and we've known in gardens for a long, long time that many plants are complementary, and we've done that in gardens, and we've also put litter or mulch on gardens to conserve moisture, control soil temperature. All of this we've known in gardening probably for 1,000 years, but we've never applied it to agriculture. So the organic people have to a degree, and we need to move that organic system even further. But the organic people have had it really close for a long time.
And you've increased your soil carbon, how many percent?
It's over 200% now. And we're seeing the benefits of that. In one of the first things we see of that is improved water holding capacity in our soils, and our crops just do better in dry times, or our pastures and grassland grow a lot better in dry times. We don't need the rainfall that we were dependent on before. So huge benefits in many ways by increasing soil carbon.
So in other words, by having more species, rather than competing, they're creating more soil carbon. Rather than creating scarcity for themselves with the water, they're actually creating creating a soil that holds more water, so there's more to go around for everybody, I guess.
That's right. Yes, yes. It's really quite amazing. It shouldn't amaze us. I guess Mother Nature developed it over a million years or more, or billions of years. Sorry. Um, so we shouldn't be surprised that yes, as soil carbon's increased and everything associated with that, everything's just become healthier and healthier. To a point now, as I said in the presentation, that the nutrients are also increasing, and the average increase has been 162% increase in all the nutrients. That's trace elements and the major elements as well. They're all increasing. Now that is not supposed to happen, and a lot of some soil scientists will argue that that's impossible. But I'm not the only person doing this. People that move in this direction all report and from their soil tests that nutrients are increasing. So we can, if we get it right, if we get agriculture right, we can do it for thousands of years into the future. If we get it wrong, which we have now, I'd suggest we're going to struggle in the next 100 years. But if we get it right, because it's regenerative, if we get this right, it regenerates the landscape. It regenerates the soil and soil ecosystem and farm ecosystem, so it will continue to constantly improve.
I was listening to Christine Jones speak, and I believe she was speaking about your soil, and she mentioned that she sent off soil to the lab and had it assayed for the available minerals. And the information they sent back to her, she calculated the total quantity of minerals. She knew that she had sent off soil that had a certain bulk density that would equate to almost 8,000 kilos per hectare in the top 50 centimeters of soil. Yep. And so it should be 7,800 kilograms that they send back if they're analyzing all of the minerals. Well, 97% of that, because I guess your soil was at about 3% carbon, rather organic. Yep. Excuse me, 3% organic content, much of which is carbon. And so the other 97% should have added up to, I guess, 97% of the roughly 8,000 kilos. And they sent back an analysis that showed a total of 200 kilos. And so she called them up, sort of tongue in cheek, I guess, and asked them. So I asked for all of the availables and totals. So where's the other 7,800 kilos? It's not accounted for here. And they said, and he said, well, yeah, that's right. A soil test is only going to tell you about 1.5 to 3% of what's there.
Yep.
She said, well, where's the other 97%? He said, well, she said, what is the other 97%? And he said, that's your minerals. And she said, so, I guess she asked if those minerals were available if those other 97% minerals were available to microbes. And he said, yes, but we don't test for that. We test for what's readily available. Yeah. So, obviously there's a lot of minerals in the soil that aren't going to show up in tests and aren't going to be showing up in our plants and in our food if we don't have the microbes, because it's their job to make it available. And the more active the soil gets, the more of those minerals will show up in the tests of the soil and in, of course, our food.
Yep, that's exactly right. And in those tests that I showed, there I didn't include nitrogen in that, and nitrogen's increased, well, more than doubled in there, but it's organic nitrogen now. So and which is more of a, well, now with the microbes are there, is more available to plants. So yeah, there's so much that we really, well, not only don't understand, but there's not even tested for in our soil tests, and there's a lot more for science to learn about this. And many people that are adopting regenerative agricultural techniques are seeing these types of results. They're seeing it in their plants, seeing it in their animals, but it doesn't always add up in the tests. So, but there's something else going on that science yet can't measure, I guess.
Yeah, well, nature, yeah, nature is far more powerful than we have fully realized up to this point. Um, so is this a lot of extra work for you to produce so much? There's so many things going on. You've got native grasses, you've got sheep, you've got stud sheep, you've got kelpie dogs. What am I
Yep.
missing? But anyhow, multiple crops,
Yeah.
multiple
And
incomes. How do isn't this making you a little too busy?
no, it actually makes it's a lot easier than what I used to do. Far easier. There's a lot less work on the farm than there used to be. And the reason why is, um, and I didn't talk about it in this presentation, and probably should have, but we to be able to generate uh, uh, more production, or produce more food is a better way of describing it. More food off a given area, off an acre. If we stack those enterprises vertically on top of each other, in other words, if those enterprises like the animals grazing, the crops growing, and native seed, all of those are complementary. If they're ecologically compatible and complementary, they support each other. So there's actually less work to do because it's being driven naturally, and everything is complementary. And so that's how and why we can generate um, more food, more production off a given area, with less inputs, less costs, and far less money to drive it. And not only that, it'll keep regenerating. So it's about enterprise stacking, and Joel Salatin actually, he does a lot of that type of thing. He describes it a little bit differently to how I describe it, but Joel stacks enterprises that are also um, complementary ecologically.
Yes, he's got quite an operation.
Yep.
So where does this type of farming work? I mean, this can't possibly work everywhere, I imagine. Does it, in what types of locations and climates can this work?
Mm. The broad principles of it can work pretty well anywhere. Um, Now, pasture cropping in itself relies on a grassland, or the majority of the species there becoming dormant at a particular year, and then the crop we're growing or planting into it um, is actively growing when that perennial grass or grassland is dormant. And that's the original concept that I developed. However, now this thing just continually evolves as I learn more. Um, and now, especially with animals, we can manipulate that grassland, so that we can create a niche, an ecological niche, where we can plant things into even a living, growing grassland. So we can manipulate it more, and we can manipulate it without herbicides. You could use a herbicide if you wanted, but we can do it without that, and we can do that with either with grazing animals. We can do it with things like mulching machinery to mulch that material. Anything to suppress that grassland, to create a niche to grow things in. So it's as broad as our imagination will allow it to be.
Could you have achieved these same results without animals?
I don't think so. Um, Although in saying that, David Brandt's doing a wonderful job without animals there, and getting wonderful soil health improvements. But no, the animals are a very essential part of this, because I'm using large mobs of animals on relatively small areas to mulch that perennial grass down, or in my case, mulch the cover onto the soil surface. They're adding nutrients in manure and urine onto that soil surface, which the plants then use. So that's producing a lot of our fertility, or a lot of our nutrients for our crop that we're planting. Um, in my case, the animals are very important. They're doing some weed control. They're also, and we're manipulating that grassland with the animals and creating a niche for the crop to be planted in. So the animals are a very important part of it. More so, well, also, as well as doing all that, a very, very important part of overall farm income. We're not just growing a crop, but we're grazing animals as well.
Is there a role in all of this to make it even better or something with GMOs? I'm not sure how that would work because I haven't seen GMOs accomplish a whole lot. But do you see any role for GMOs?
Am I allowed to answer that question by swearing? I don't think there's any role for GMOs at all. I think they're a disaster, and all they are is really the last the original green revolution failed. The GMOs are being developed and be often promoted as the next green revolution. Why would you want the next green revolution for? The last one was a failure. No, GMOs have no place at all. We don't need GMOs. There's enough diversity in nature and to select as we've traditionally done. Anyway, we don't need GMOs. GMOs, all they're doing is allowing the use of herbicides and pesticides and insecticides on a crop. No, there's absolutely no place for GMOs at all. And we don't need them anyway. Yep. No, making multinational companies wealthy and sending farmers broke and making people all over the world very unhealthy and sick and dying, I'd suggest.
Yeah, it's amazing the research that has come out from Professor is it Hubel?
Yeah. Yep.
Who has discovered that at least part of the way that Roundup works, that glyphosate works, is it's a chelator of minerals and nutrients. So it's blocking these nutrients from being utilized by the plants.
Yep.
And so they develop plants that I guess that could survive on fewer of those nutrients or something. I actually have to look into that further myself. And I thought it was interesting. You mentioned that the first step that you help farmers get through is to move toward other herbicides first. Is get off glyphosate as sort of a first step, an essential step to stop killing the soil and stop tying up minerals.
Yep. It's interesting, and I do workshops and talks around the world on this and to get people started. And that transition from industrial agriculture, moving it more towards a biological system, is important. Like to transition from an industrial form of agriculture to organic agriculture in one go is a recipe to go broke. People do it, but you can transition off that gradually, which is a better way to do it. It's no point in wanting to be green and going broke. But so I transition people and get them onto I guess a softer herbicide if there is any such thing, and then gradually show them how to wean off many or all of those inputs over time, and then you can transition off that and still be very profitable. Income is still flowing, and then gradually wean off those inputs.
How do you teach this to people as far as lectures, courses, and do you have anything in development so that more growers can learn from you?
Yeah, I've been developing and hopefully it'll be out soon an online course so we can get a message out to more people around the world. I get to the States almost every year now. I was just over there in July doing workshops. I was in Kansas and Oklahoma and California last time. Hopefully we'll get this course up and running and in the next few months and online course, which will get the message out and on how we can do this. A lot of this is very simple. there's nothing very complicated about the pasture cropping and my work. Can't be very complicated if two guys drinking beer all night can dream it up. So, so, uh, it is actually it is quite simple, and really what we're doing is mimicking nature very, very closely. We don't need to reinvent anything. Blueprint's already been written. We need to just mimic that a lot, mimic natural systems a lot closer.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of summarizing it. And I think it's pretty instructive that you guys came up with the idea uh, by simply not having the money for inputs any longer. And you said, well, we got to figure out something, something
Yep.
that doesn't require all of this extraneous. I mean, you didn't think of it as extraneous, I suppose, at the time, but you
Yeah.
didn't have the money for herbicides. You didn't have, so let's
That's
just
right.
plant right into this, the dormant grassland and see what happens, and work.
Yeah. Yes, that's exactly right. We simply didn't have the money, and often change happens because of a disaster. In my case, that was certainly the case, but change often happens that way because then people are forced, as I was forced to do it a different way because I didn't have the money to continue with the methods I was using.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, thanks again, Colin. This has been great.
Okay, thank you.